Good afternoon, everyone. This is Tim Gleisner, Head of Collections at the Library of Michigan, speaking with Michigan Notable Book 2021 author Joseph Harris, author of You're in the Wrong Place, a collection of stories. Joe, how are you today?
Very good, Tim. It's great to be here.
And where are you calling from today, Joe?
I'm calling from Oak Park.
Oak Park, so right here in Michigan. Very good. And Joe, just like I start off with every author, I'm just wondering, can you give us a little bit of your background, maybe just about, how you became a writer and how you got to that point of writing?
Sure, yeah. So I was born in Detroit and I grew up in Pleasant Ridge. I graduated from Ferndale High School. From there, I attended Emerson College in Boston, which is when I took my first creative writing classes. I actually went there for screenwriting, but I think the more literature classes that I took, it kind of like shifted what I wanted to write about.
Hmm.
And I graduated from Emerson and moved back to the Detroit area. I went to Wayne State's Master of English program with a concentration in creative writing and graduated in 2013. And that's when I pretty much began what became You're in the Wrong Place. It started as a directed study with a few of my professors there, just because I hadn't written many stories since Emerson, and then I kind of wanted to go in a different direction with what I wanted to write. And then at the encouragement of my professors, I applied to the University of Minnesota's MFA program and was very luckily accepted in 2015 and was able to work with several really, really excellent fiction writers, Charles Baxter, Sugi Ganeshanathan, and Julie Schumacher. And they basically took the work that I'd done at Wayne and tried to expand and condense certain parts and try to put it around a central theme, which became dynamic fabricating in your own place. And I graduated in 2018, and as soon as I graduated, I sent the book to Annie Martin, who is the editor-in-chief of the Made in Michigan Writer Series at Wayne State University Press, and very, very fortunate that they accepted it for publication, and it was published in September of last year.
So I have to ask, would you consider yourself then a full-time professional writer?
Not yet. I would love to eventually. I think my definition of professional full-time writer is someone that makes their primary income off book sales. And I'm
Okay.
not there yet, but I would love to be at some point. But I think that's going to take a little bit while to get to that point.
And so my question, and I ask everybody about the writing process, everything else like that. So you obviously have a full-time job. You obviously dedicate a lot of time. Years in this case. How often do you find yourself writing?
I've actually been very fortunate the past year and a half. I was actually one of the first people in Michigan to be hospitalized with the coronavirus.
Oh,
And I spent 6 days at Beaumont Hospital in March of 2020. But because I got sick with it, I've been able to get unemployment since then. And
okay.
I've been writing almost every day for the past year and a half, which has been a tremendous blessing and one that I'm pretty sure I won't be able to have again.
Right.
So yeah, I've written a second collection of stories that's set in northern Michigan, and I'm sending those out for um, individually to magazines right now. And then I'm trying really hard to complete a third collection of short stories that's set in Detroit. And then I also am halfway done with a novel that's set in London that involves a fictional soccer team. And I would love to have that finished by the end of the year. So in terms of process, yeah, I think that for me, if I write 1,000 words a day, I think that's a pretty good number to hit and pretty realistic. And sometimes, I'm able to do that in 45 minutes, and sometimes that takes me 5 or 6 hours. So as long as I'm able to get to hit that word count every day, I think I'm, putting something together.
So pre-COVID, though, with You're in the Wrong Place, a lot of that was written pre-COVID. Uh, I mean, uh, how did that come about? And I've got a bunch of questions in my head, Joe. So please, I apologize if I'm scattershot. But uh, you know, uh, first, how did the stories come about? And You're in the Wrong Place. And then, secondly, how long have you known that you wanted to be a writer? Obviously, your educational trajectory, but did you know before then? Were you in high school? Were you dabbling in writing? What was that like?
Yeah, so to answer your first question, I started writing You're in the Wrong Place during my first semester at Wayne State, which would have been in September of 2012. And that was basically kind of like I wanted to address the recession in a way that was a little more productive, perhaps. The recession obviously hit Michigan and Detroit especially harder than I think anywhere else in the country. Um, Employment was very precarious, and even the jobs that you were working didn't really pay much.
Sure.
So, for me at least, I thought I was kind of like stuck in this almost purgatorial atmosphere that I didn't believe at the time was going to end.
Mhm.
And a lot of the self-destructive behaviors that are present in You're in the Wrong Place are areas that I could have seen myself going down towards had I not tried to probably turn my frustration into something creative and expressive. So the root kind of grew from there. And eventually, I think to tie all the stories together, I was between summers at Minnesota, able to stay with some family friends on the east side of Ferndale and just write all summer because of funding I got from the University of Minnesota. And so I was like, well, I'm here every day. I might as well just set all the stories here and kind of like expand them from there. So yeah, it was basically just trying to like address the recession from not, in my opinion, like a purely bleak viewpoint, and to kind of expand it and make it a little more philosophical, of having the recession not be something that's purely economic, but something that brings up a lot of really personal questions, for me personally, I think for a lot of people that were living through it at the time. In terms of me writing, when I was in high school, I wrote just some like fun plays for class with my friends, that were like pretty like comedic and just involving people in the class and involving the teachers, that got like pretty good responses, but that was kind of just for fun. I loved movies growing up, and for especially in high school, like I really, really wanted to be a screenwriter. But once I got to Emerson, I think they did a really good job of making you aware of the realities of the film industry, and
Mm.
that, like everything that you write has to follow a very strict formula. And most of the time it'll be rewritten by a bunch of people. And what winds up making it to the screen, if it ever does, will not really look like you want it to. And although that is like a very lucrative career that's been
Right.
followed by several of my classmates that I went to Emerson with, I thought it was just kind of limiting in terms of what I wanted to write about. And when I discovered fiction, and especially short stories, the idea that you could really create this world that you're familiar with, was just really, really fascinating to me. And so that's when I started taking workshops, was my sophomore year at Emerson. And I was, very, very bad when I started, and it just made me want to just work even harder and read even more and try to master the form.
So I got to ask about short stories. So, I mean, we've had collections before, and I interviewed several authors last year. Yours is actually the first one this year that I've interviewed anyone about short stories about. And I, talk about the theme. I mean, do you feel like there needs to be a running theme out through a collection of short stories? I mean, the one that I always think about is Bonnie Jo Campbell with her short story set in Southwest Michigan. And there's always that, there is a theme that runs through that. But talk to us about, I mean, you talked about the recession, and I have a lot of questions. The therapy, you talked about almost like the therapeutic aspects of the recession in writing. And what was that theme? And secondly, what were some of those lessons you learned through your writing?
Yeah. Well, I guess mainly, I'm not sure that every story collection has to necessarily have a theme. For me, it makes them a lot easier to write when you're looking at a project.
Hmm.
There are several excellent story collections that don't really have a theme, that they're just, and they have different settings and much different characters. But for me, because this was my first book, I thought that without, this kind of like running theme of the recession that's set around this one factory, and all the stories are connected with people that work there, or worked there, or knew someone that worked there, that was going to be, that was going to set me a target that I could actually hit, rather than kind of being a little more scattershot.
Right.
And yeah, I don't know. I think that like the reason that that theme was so attractive to me was because it was pretty inescapable in Detroit. I graduated from Emerson and moved back here in May of 2009, which was like very, very tough. And that was kind of like an inescapable reality. And I think just seeing all of the limitations that were put on, I want to say like, especially my life and my family's life, by just like not having access to money, by not having access to employment at the time, like it really does change your life and your aspirations pretty dramatically.
Right.
And that is, I mean, for me at least, like every day there was so much conflict that was like both visible to me and conflict within myself. And that conflict to me is kind of like the engine that drives short stories. And so like it seemed to be like a pretty good subject to explore.
Nice. And talk about the factory. I mean, was there a factory that you had in mind when you were writing? Did that act as a vehicle? I mean, did that act as almost like a microcosm for Detroit as a whole at that point?
Yeah. So between summers and then when I moved back for the next 2 years, I worked at a fabricating shop in Roseville.
Mm-hmm.
And I did most of the general labor jobs that they had there, I think with the exception of machining and welding, because that takes a lot of education and skill and you have to trade for that. But
Right.
yeah, I worked there, and yeah, the hours were like really long, but I have still yet to make as much money as I made there just because we were working so much overtime. And although I think in the book I didn't want to get into like the specifics of factory labor in every story, I thought from my experience working at the factory, that would give me a starting point to kind of branch out from. And in terms of the location, on the east side of Ferndale, I think on the corner of 9 Mile and Wanda, there's like a giant industrial park. And when I was writing the book, most of those were closed. And so that kind of gave me like a physical place where I could set it. And then from that setting, kind of expand outwards to talk about the rest of the neighborhood and the rest of the region.
Nice. And I got to ask, short story. So you said when you began, you were having difficulties with it, and you decided you wanted to conquer that form. Like what did that take? I mean, what did it take to get the point? Because I'll be honest with you, we heard about you before the book committee even saw the book, and there was one person in particular who's like, we got to read this guy. And so I can tell you right now that there was definitely some noise going around about Joseph Harris and his collection of stories, especially from the Detroit area. So I mean, you obviously, I don't want to say you conquered the form. I don't know. I mean, maybe you have, but I mean, you obviously have progressed quite a deal. So like, what did that take? I mean, because I'll be honest with you, for somebody like me, I would find that extremely intimidating. I just be like, yep, no, I didn't do it. I'm done.
Mhm.
And but I mean, like, how did you get through that?
Well, first of all, that's extremely flattering to hear.
Oh, it's true though. I'm just gonna tell you right now, like we heard about you. So
that
go
is,
ahead.
it's extremely flattering and really great to hear. But for me, I don't know. I think there's just been like a few things in my life that I've like really, really enjoyed, but have never really been good at to start with. And one of which was soccer. Like I played soccer for most of my life. And when I started playing when I was like 5 or 6 or 7, for a while, I was very, very bad, like really, really bad. But I don't know, I just like fell in love with the game and how, all the intricacies of it and all the different aspects of the game that I needed to get better at in order to become a decent player.
Hmm.
And I did eventually, like I wound up playing in college and being the captain of my high school soccer team, which was great. But that honestly just took hours and hours and hours and hours of work. And for the short stories, the first ones that I wrote, I was like shocked at, like, I was like, wow, this is like really hard, and how like bad those first like stories were. And it honestly took, just trial and error constantly. And I think for me, half of it was reading. I just read exhaustively in college, and especially between when I graduated from Emerson, when I started at Wayne State, I was reading a book a week at that point, just trying to pick out, what was working and what wasn't. And I
When you
think
were reading,
especially,
was it just short stories, or were you reading all across the map when it came to fiction, things like that?
yeah, all across the map. I think for short stories in particular, Charles Baxter really stuck out to me just because he set all of his stories, in the Detroit region. And I think structurally they were so fascinating because they kind of, and especially for Believers, which is one of his collections and probably my favorite collection of stories, it introduces you to this world and kind of like lulls you into this false sense of security. And then something will happen that you completely don't expect that changes the trajectory and also like physically changes the structure of the stories themselves. And just the idea of being so immersive and being so unpredictable was something that for me, I said, I have to learn how to do that. But for me, the only ways that I did that was just by like reading and rereading and rereading, and then just like writing and writing and writing constantly. I mean, there was at least 200 pages of stories that didn't make it into You're in the Wrong Place just because they weren't good enough because I was still trying to learn how to do it. But yeah, I mean, I don't think personally that there's any kind of shortcut to the short story form because it is so compact and you have to put so much into such a like tight structure. The limitations are to me what is so exciting, and that's why I think it was so challenging, at least for me, to learn how to do. But after you do, enough and you fail enough and you finally get to a point where you write something that is, I think decent, and you're like, I think that this, like, not only me, someone else that reads this will be engaged by this, then you can start building from that.
And I obviously you're from the Detroit area.
Mhm.
You were born in Detroit. What is it about Detroit? I mean, what is it about for you that makes it such a, I don't want to call it a character, but I'm going to call it that anyways. Because I mean, I've talked to other Detroit writers. One last year, one of my favorites was Esperanza Centron with her collection of stories from Shades. And, not being from Detroit, I mean, I always find Detroit to be a cipher, and I love to see it through other people's eyes. So, what is it for you about Detroit, and just what grabs you other than it's your home place?
I really do think that, and I've lived in several other places, and I just don't think there's anywhere as interesting as Detroit. It was this very small town, and then it had this, like gigantic boom with the auto industry, and then grew exponentially. And, then when the auto industry started to contract, we had all of these, social and economic issues that were pretty unique to the city and that I think are still ongoing. And because of the auto industry, it, drew people from all over the country and all over the world. And this is such like a diverse place to live, and you're in contact with so many other cultures and people that are so different from you. And I don't know, it's just like, it's that alone I think is like really inspirational. I think this is like probably the least homogenous place I've ever lived. There's this like constant dialogue between cultures and different ideas that I think is, that for me is where a lot of creativity comes from, is just taking all of these ideas and trying to like put your own, like synthesize them and like create your own out of them. And I don't know, like I really do think, I think it's in the third story in You're in the Wrong Place, Exit Stage Left, where there is a conversation between the characters in there about, like, why do you stay here when it's so hard to live? And I don't know, it's just like, I do think that Detroit is like really beautiful. Like I think there's a beauty to the freeways and the factories and the bungalows. Like, I don't know, I think that, like our air, a lot of people when they first get to Detroit are just like, oh man, it smells here. But like every time I used to like get off the plane coming home from somewhere else and you like walk out the airport doors and you just kind of get like hit with that like wave of exhaust, like to me that is such an elating feeling. Like I feel that I'm home. And I think more than anything else, what's so inspiring is just like the people. Both sides of my family are here, and I've been very, very lucky to have met, so many incredible people that are still friends of mine, from grade school and middle school and high school and for grad school, and playing on different soccer teams, and just like being like around, like there's this like incredible quality to the people here that have this like incredible sense of humor and this incredible resilience that's really hard to find anywhere else. But for me at least, I mean, yeah, it's always been like really hard for me to make a living in Detroit, and I think that's true with a lot of other people, like living in a place that you love that doesn't necessarily always love you back. And that's also like breeds this sense of conflict that, to me, again, I think is like the fulcrum of any great short story. So
Fantastic. So then another question for you. I mean, why fiction? I mean, you could have done nonfiction. You could have, I mean, I think of all the nonfiction I've read about Detroit and everything else. Why fiction? What does that allow you to do as a writer?
I think fiction opens up, for me at least, like so many different possibilities. At Minnesota, you had to take workshops outside of your genre. So I did try writing poetry, and I just like couldn't get it. Like my poems were just really, really tacky, and I didn't really have the mastery of, like rhythm and structure. And poetry is incredibly difficult. I think that poetry is probably, for me at least, like the hardest form to write in, because
Hmm.
if short stories are concise, then poetry is like the most concise. You have to bring up all of this emotion and all of this imagery and all of these ideas, and you have to like boil it and reduce it to its like most base form. So that was too hard for me. And for nonfiction, I was really, really uncomfortable with writing about myself, like very, very uncomfortable. And especially I think like writing about my friends and family. With fiction, at least, I think that you're able to hide a lot of the reality that I at least, had. You're able to take all of these different emotions that you're feeling and assign them to a character, or to assign them to a mood. It's so malleable. It's something that you can like really play with and like expand and contract at your will. It gives you a tremendous amount of freedom as a writer. And I think more than anything for me, I was just talking to a friend's book club about this a few weeks ago. I think with other creative forms like music, for instance, it's something that you can hear. With visual art, it's something that you can see. With movies, it's like a synthesis of those two. But writing for me is just words on a page. It's completely silent. It just is there. And the idea, when in the past that I've read some books, Wuthering Heights is probably my favorite novel. And the first time I read that book, I was so incredibly moved by it. I had all of these physical reactions to that book. And I just thought that was so incredible that an author is able to provoke physical reactions with just words. And this like silent object is able to like bring this entire world and these people in it like to you in this form. I just thought was fascinating. And that's, for me, was like, I have to learn how to do this. I would love to learn through this, almost like silent form, how to move people and make them think and make them feel in that way.
Fantastic. And you talk about malleability. I can't speak today. Um, with this, I mean, you talked about you had 200 pages left out.
Mm.
What made the cut? Why? What was it for you that these stories, really coalesce together?
I owe a great debt to one of my professors at Minnesota, Sugi Ganeshanathan, who's also a fantastic novelist. I think it was originally her idea to like have all the stories coalesce around like a single point. And a lot of the other stories, I think that I wasn't able to connect to dynamic fabricating in some way. They didn't make it, but I think a lot of them were just a little, I don't want to say like amateurish, but they didn't fit the arc of the book. And
Mm.
to me, the arc starts with the title story. It starts with the fourth story, You're in the Wrong Place. I think the first story kind of sets the scene for everything. It introduces you to the narrators. It introduces you to the context. It introduces you to the themes. I think the next two are just kind of this like lull or a kind of like a calm before the storm, and starting with You're in the Wrong Place and continuing up until the Slow Death, which is the second to last story, which I think is kind of a catharsis story. There is this kind of like continuing arc of tension
Mhm.
that's going through there. And a lot of the stories I couldn't fit into that arc. It just didn't make sense for me. It either was they were too repetitive, or I thought they kind of like slowed down the momentum that's building in there.
So those stories that were cut out, I mean, are they going to be work that would be seen in future pieces or in your next collection of short stories or even your upcoming novel?
I don't think so. I think that I'll, everything that could have been salvaged from those was turned into the last story, Lorcas Torres, which is why it's so long. Out of all the stories that didn't make it, I thought that there was a character or a sentence or a line of dialogue or a description that I wanted to take. So I kind of like took all of those parts and kind of like turned it into the final story. So yeah, I think that the rest of them, I have had time, you know, in the during the pandemic to go back and read over them, and I think you have to kind of learn to when to throw in the towel when something's like,
Really? I mean, like nothing to salvage at all?
yeah, I don't think so.
I
I
mean,
think
that's hard, isn't it? I mean, I'm sorry. I don't mean to get so emphatic, but I mean, that's
no,
hard.
it's fine because I just had to do this with this second collection was kind of framed by my master's thesis at Wayne State, which was a novella. And so I was like, well, this will be the starting point for the whole collection. And I'll just like, you know, riff off that. And a couple months ago, like I was like going to this thing that I based the whole collection on, like trying to like salvage it. And eventually I was like, I have to write like 2 or 3 more stories to like replace it to get it up to 200 pages, because this is just not going to work. It's too, it doesn't sound good, it doesn't flow well, and it's not going to fit in with, I think, what I thought was the quality of the rest of the collection. So it is hard, but at the same time it's liberating, because if you keep like doing something over and over that's still not working, it's just kind of like a waste of your time that I think could be better spent trying to do something or write something that you will be able to kind of put out there.
And I just mentioned it, but I'm just wondering, you know, you delved into short stories, you're dealing with Michigan,
Mhm.
and now you're going into the novel. Why the novel? Like, what does that do for you beyond the short story?
I think I think like I was saying earlier with how hard I found short stories, like I find writing novels to be very hard to be able to, for me at least, sustain a plot for, you know, 300 pages is very, very difficult, because I think for this novel that I want to write, and perhaps going forward, like I want to maintain the momentum that I have in my stories. I think that for me, one of the things that I think I have a good grasp on in You're in the Wrong Place is the momentum of the stories. I think that they have this like natural movement, and I think that's, for me, what makes them easier to write and easier to read, especially. And so the idea that I have to like keep that momentum going for such a long period of time is daunting, but it's something that I'm excited to learn how to do.
Great. So then, you know, just you know, Michigan has definitely been a scene and everything else, but now you were mentioning the fact that you're going to write something about London. I mean, what's that take to go from your home place, and maybe you visited London, maybe even lived there for a time, but I mean, what, how hard is that?
Yeah, I was actually very, very lucky. My second year in Minnesota, we did have a novel writing class where we all had to turn in 100 pages of a novel. And I was very close to the deadline where I had to turn mine in, and I had nothing. I was like thinking of writing this one thing, and like I was saying earlier, it was just like not working. And I was like,
Very,
how can I write 100 pages of something in 2 weeks? And because I love soccer so much, I was like, well, I'll just like try that. And my favorite soccer team that I've watched for a really long time is Arsenal, and they're in London. So I was like, well, I'll just set it in London just because I'm familiar with the history of the club. And also, like, I'm a big fan of history, so I was a little familiar with English history
Yeah.
at that point. And yeah, that section of the novel that I turned in actually got me a fellowship to go to London that summer. So I was able to spend 3 weeks there and just do a ton of research and visit all the places. And I got to go to a game at Arsenal's Emirates Stadium, which was incredible because I'd always wanted to go and I never thought I would be able to do it. So I was able to take all that research back, and I still like have all of that in order to like incorporate into that. So, and it's exciting for me because yeah, it's somewhere completely different, but I was able to spend like a lot of time, well, not a lot, but like a pretty decent amount of time there and kind of like soak it in to have a frame of reference.
So I have to ask, were you heartbroken this past week with the Euros and Italy?
I didn't really, first of all, I love the European Championships. I think
It's
that they're,
fantastic.
yeah, they're like one of the best sporting tournaments on earth, and it was a really good tournament this year. But yeah, I wasn't really rooting for a specific team. I think I was just rooting for like really good games because the tournament in France 5 years ago was so boring. It like no one attacked, like everyone defended it, especially the final was just like watching paint dry. And with this final, especially, it was so exciting. And
Yes.
obviously, I felt like really bad for England just because they haven't won a tournament in a really long time. But I thought Italy was the best team, and I thought that they deserved to win.
Fantastic. So now with the pandemic, you've had coronavirus.
Mm.
How's that affected your work? And I mean, you've had time to write this past year.
Mhm.
Um, is it giving you ideas? I mean, how's it affected you generally for your work?
I think mainly it's just given me time. Although, I loved being the reason that and I think a lot of other writers like gravitate towards the academy is because that's the only way to get funding.
Mm.
Obviously, you can apply to different fellowships and grants like the Kresge or the NEA, but those are, insanely competitive and they don't take too many. But I at least wanted to go to graduate school for writing because someone was going to take an interest in your work and to edit it and to clean it up and to give you suggestions, which is not something that you can really do on your own. Um, but at the same time, while you're in those spaces, you have to teach and you have to do your coursework for other classes, and it's a lot of work outside of you like having to like sit down and produce something for your own classes. But for the past year and a half, like I've had nothing but time to write, and that has been like a miracle. It's been like the best thing that has honestly like ever happened to me, to be able to wake up every day and say that the only thing that I need to do today is write 1,000 words is so liberating. And yeah, I mean, I think for the different projects that I've been able to work on and complete, it just like knowing that you have the time to just to fully focus on it. Obviously, there are a few, fiction writers that get to the point where, they make enough money off the books that they sell where that's, their life. They just get to wake up and write every day. But, I'm not there yet and I might not ever get there. So I just wanted to make sure that I made the most of this time and got the most done possible.
Fantastic. And then in summary, what did it mean to you to be chosen as a Michigan Notable Book Author?
It was fantastic. I know Charles Baxter, whose work I love and who was one of my professors in Minnesota, was one of the first people to reach out to me. And because he, I think, won it in 2004. And yeah, American Salvage is such a fantastic book. And I know that Bonnie Jo Campbell won it in 2009 or 2010. Jim Harrison, who's another one, a writer who I deeply admire, won several. It's the highest honor that a writer from Michigan can ever receive. So it was just fantastic. It was honestly like, yeah, I can't even put it into words to know that like I will, in perpetuity be joined with these fantastic writers and their fantastic books is honestly like the greatest honor from being from the state that I could have received.
Well, I got to say again, and it's well deserved. There was a lot of buzz about Joseph Harris and his book. We heard about you again before we even got the book. So thank you for your contribution to Michigan literature, and thank you for being here today. Is there anything you'd like to end in summation today, just with our audience and just overall?
Yeah, I'm not really sure. I mean, I really hope that everyone that read the book, I hope that, it at least interested you, and that you found some value in it. I'm also really hoping now that things are opening up. I've had to basically do all these like virtual interviews, which have been fantastic because I would have had no way to communicate with any potential readers. But I'm really hoping that as the vaccine rate gets higher and things start opening up, that I'm able to go out and actually talk to people in person and meet the readers in person. So I'm very, very excited to meet all the readers of this book in the future.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you for being here today, and thank you for sharing your time with us, and thank you to all of you viewing us today. And again, we're here with the author Joseph Harris, author of "You're in the Wrong Place" by Wayne State University Press. And Joe, thank you so much for today.
Thanks so much, Tim. I appreciate it.